We do get people watching us on the web, both live and later on, so please remember. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce Marcy Schwartz, who's the Senior Vice President, Director of Transportation Technology at CH2M Hill. And I'm going to ask her, before she starts her talk on context-sensitive solutions, to tell us a little bit about herself and how she got to where she is today.
Turn your microphones on, please.
Is it on now?
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Hi, everybody. Marcy Schwartz from CH2M Hill here in Portland. But I started off in New York City, where I went to school. My undergraduate work, believe it or not, is in English. And then I got a master's in urban and regional planning from Hunter College. I worked as, my first job out of school was as the planning director for the City of New York YWCA, where I did real estate in New York City, sort of trading buildings and stuff. It was very interesting. But then I proceeded to work for the New York City Planning Department for quite a few years. And my most notable project there was actually doing the initial land use study that led to the development of Soho, which is, I think, those of you who've been to New York, is quite a different place now. It was very much a blue-collar manufacturing center at the time, and New York was trying to keep jobs in the city, but they knew artists were moving into that area, and they needed to figure out how to balance the land use. So we did this whole plan for how to keep the jobs there and to allow the artists to live there. And of course, over time, the artists just took over, and now it's very commercialized. And so now that same thing is happening in neighborhoods nearby there. Shortly after working in New York, maybe just 2 years, I came out to Oregon, and I've been in Oregon for 30 years. My first job out here was as a planner for the city of Salem and for the Mid-Willamette Valley COG. And I've been with CH2M Hill now for 26 years. So that might give you some idea of my age, which is too bad. But anyway, I've done a lot of different things for CH2M. My job now is as the Director of Transportation Technology. And that really means figuring out what is happening in the industry and what our staff needs to know to be able to meet the needs of our clients. So looking at what's happening, what trends are occurring in the industry, what changes that means for us in terms of tools and learning that our people need to have, and making sure that we share that technology across our company so that the best practices are shared across all of our different offices. So that's plenty about me. And today, I'm delighted to be able to talk with you about context-sensitive solutions. Based on years of experience with controversial projects around the country, I'm really a strong advocate of CSS as a set of tools and processes that help us to meet our transportation needs as well as the needs of our cities and communities. So I see this as a major shift in the approach to transportation planning and design, and it's going to shape the skills that are needed by future transportation planners and designers. So I think that's why, at least it's, I hope, why you'll be interested in this. So today, I plan to discuss, let's see if I can figure this out, what CSS is, where it came from, what are its key components and outcomes, and what are the experiences of the departments of transportation who've tried to implement this. And please ask questions as I go if you have them. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, but if you have questions, just let me know. And I guess you have to use your keypads. And will I know if people are asking questions?
Well, they'll raise their hand.
Okay, all right. Good, okay. All right, so what is CSS? It's a concept. No, it's a philosophy. No, it's a movement. Actually, it's a little of each of these things. And let's get the terminology out of the way to start with. CSS has a lot of different advocates, and many of them talk about this idea in different ways. Maryland, which was the first state DOT to embrace and institutionalize CSS, adopted the term thinking beyond the pavement to capture the idea that a highway project extends beyond the highway itself. A few years ago, when the idea was gaining momentum around the country, the most common term used by Federal Highway Administration and the DOTs was called context-sensitive design. Scenic America, an organization that's in the forefront of this movement, refers to place-sensitive design because they focus more on the topography, the visual, the community surroundings of a transportation facility. Many agencies, most notably the Utah DOT, became concerned with the broad-based outcomes that extended beyond the design activities. They've adopted the term context-sensitive solutions to ensure that context sensitivity goes beyond the narrow design focus and really relates also to planning, construction, operation, and maintenance of facilities. So from their point of view, CSS refers to any function of a transportation agency. Another view of context sensitivity emphasizes the broad nature of potential project solutions. Not every context-sensitive project even has a design component, after all. There are certainly some solutions that are just operational in nature. So generally speaking, the transportation community seems to be migrating toward the use of the term CSS, or context-sensitive solutions, to embody the broad nature of the concept's potential applications. But the bottom line in all of these terms and on this whole thing is that they all mean the same thing. We're seeking a context-sensitive outcome, and a context-sensitive process is used. So what is CSS anyway? What sets it apart from the way we are doing transportation projects now? The most often quoted definition of CSS emerged from a Maryland State Highway Administration conference on this topic in 1998. And the quote is, CSS asks questions first about the need and purpose of the transportation project, and then equally addresses safety, mobility, the preservation of scenic, aesthetic, historic, environmental, and other community values. We'll come back to this definition a little later because it really has some controversial elements. In terms of process, CSS involves a collaborative, interdisciplinary approach in which citizens are part of the design team. So, on the whole, it's a much more holistic approach than we're used to. It requires considering not only the geometry and traffic service requirements of a roadway, but the broader purpose and need from a community perspective. Another important difference in this process is that it includes all stakeholder groups and provides them a meaningful opportunity for public involvement, contributing to the outcomes of the project. And this requires participation not only by stakeholder groups, but a broad range of professional disciplines: landscape architects, urban designers, decision scientists, economists, depending on the individual project. So you might ask, well, where would we apply CSS? Where is it appropriate? The literature often talks about the importance of being context sensitive in scenic locations, in historic towns and corridors. But it also talks about typical projects that are bridges, scenic highways, rural and mountain highways, urban and suburban arterials, state routes through small towns, and freeways. Well, that's pretty much the whole gamut of highway projects, if you think about it. But my answer to the question of where CSS should apply is that every single project has a context, and so therefore it's appropriate for CSS to be applied everywhere. I also get asked a lot, well, where does it fit in the whole project development process? The biggest bang for the buck is probably in planning, preliminary design, and final design. But as many states have been implementing CSS around the country, they've been expanding the range of CSS activities, going all the way from statewide planning, long-range planning, all the way through construction, operation, and maintenance. Where did it come from? A long time ago, before you guys were around, in the 1960s, the mode of operation was what's called decide, announce, defend. You may have heard of this. It was assumed that technical experts should proceed on the basis of professional judgment and then explain to everybody what they did later. The public had little, if any, role in the project development process. Then, in the late 1960s, the NEPA legislation, NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, is that something you're familiar with? Okay. The NEPA legislation was enacted that required public hearings on proposed projects. While agencies allowed the public to review and comment, it was mostly after all the important decisions had already been made. So this lack of meaningful access to the decision-making process created a lot of frustration among environmental activists. The 1980s brought a lot more consultation with representatives of various interest groups prior to the agency decision. It was a time when advisory groups were often set up, but very interestingly, they didn't include the major opposition to the projects. So again, even though there was movement forward in this consultation, the people who were left out of the process became involved in very sophisticated and highly educated interest groups that had the ability to mobilize very quickly, using the internet in a lot of cases toward the end of the 80s, and many projects were stopped at the political level. So by the 1990s, some project managers at some agencies recognized that successful project development required meaningful involvement of stakeholders, of all these stakeholders, of all the interest groups. And ICE-T's requirements for early and continuous public involvement underscored that understanding. It also spawned lots of strategies for more meaningful involvement of groups in transportation decision-making. In this approach, there's true collaboration with the agency and the public jointly shaping the project. But even though it's out there, it's been very slow to catch on. So where does that leave us today? Despite our attempts at meaningful public involvement, our customers have expressed widespread dissatisfaction with highway projects. The public and community interest groups are very resistant when it's clear that there are measurable adverse impacts on communities through which these highways pass. No longer are the benefits of the improvements, the DOTs call these projects improvements. So no longer does the public accept these improvements, which are usually faster travel times, greater safety, less delay. They're not widely accepted or perceived as worth the cost to the community. No longer does the public unquestioningly accept the assumptions of engineering professionals, regardless of how well-grounded they are. Despite being recognized as necessary to public health and economic well-being of a community, roadways are now increasingly viewed as permanent intrusions on the landscape. An increasingly savvy public opposes projects on all these grounds, all these bullets that you see up here. And we keep adding to this list all the time. Air toxics, for example, isn't on that list, but it probably will be over the next year or so. And even if stakeholders aren't completely opposed to projects for these reasons, they are extremely frustrated by the process that they're put through. And so getting projects built is harder and harder. So really, in the end, CSS is all about completing projects. It's a direct response to the situation we see ourselves in with our stakeholders. And I think it's among the most significant concepts that's emerged in highway project planning and design in recent years. As you may know, it has been listed by the Federal Highway Administration as one of its vital few initiatives this year. So it's reflecting what's viewed by the Federal Administration as an urgent need for the DOTs to consider highway projects as more than the development of transportation facilities. CSS actually got its start from the Federal Highway publication, Flexibility in Highway Design. This was in '97. Are any of you familiar with that document? One person back there. I meant to bring a copy of it, but it's available online on the Federal Highway CSS site. It was prepared as a guide for planners and engineers to use in designing highways that incorporate community values and are safe, efficient, effective mechanisms for the movement of people and goods. So the guide doesn't really present any new or different geometric design standards. It explained that I don't even know if you're familiar with the Ashdow Green Book. It's sort of a guide to geometric design. A few more nods here. Okay. That's usually considered the Bible of how to design roadways. But this document, the Flexibility in Highway Design document, indicated that that's not a design manual. It's only intended to provide guidance on a range of values for critical dimensions. It underscored that sufficient flexibility is permitted to encourage independent designs tailored to meet the local circumstances. So the document was intended to provoke innovative thinking that would produce better highway designs. Since then, a number of key conferences and activities have moved CSS forward. As a major initiative in 2000, Federal Highway Administration sponsored 5 states that agreed to implement the CSS approach and then share what they learned with the other states. And those 5 are Connecticut, Maryland, Kentucky, Minnesota, and Utah. And I'll describe some of their key learnings in a few minutes. Last year, the National Cooperative Highway Research Program put out Report 480. It was written by a few of us at CH2M Hill, and it documents the best practices in CSS based on our interviews with the pilot states, review of the literature, case studies, and some of our own observations. This slide is really the core of the document 480. It shows the project development process. I don't know if I can move. The columns here represent the critical success factors for CSS, and the rows moving across represent steps in the CSS process. The document is set up to describe what happens in each of these cells of the matrix, so that for each one of those, if you're interested in achieving environmental sensitivity and you're trying to define the problem, you can go to that section of the document and get tips and tools and examples. So it's really set up to help people who are actually trying to implement this. It also includes a chapter on organizational needs for implementing CSS, as well as case studies from the various pilot states. But it mostly has lots and lots of examples. This is also available on, well, it's available off the TRB website, and if you want information about that, I can provide it to you. But what I'd like to focus on mostly today is these 4 critical success factors: effective decision making, reflecting community values, achieving environmental sensitivity, and ensuring safe and feasible solutions. So if we go to effective decision making first, a traditional decision process is an advocacy process. It focuses on gathering preferences and opinions from stakeholders, but it doesn't really adequately figure out what to do with that information once we have it. It doesn't define the decision process. It just dumps all that stakeholder input into a black box, which leads to stakeholder frustration, polarization, and ultimately political gamesmanship. On the other hand, a structured decision process specifies the technical milestones and related opportunities for public involvement and ensures that the dialogue with stakeholders actually has something to do with the decisions that are going to get made. It integrates public involvement into the overall project management. A lot of times, public involvement sort of goes on out here as a sidebar, but in a CSS approach, it's really integrated completely with the management of the project, and it becomes sort of the spine of the project, so that the project manager really is dovetailing the outreach activities with the technical activities as they move forward. This diagram represents a traditional decision process. The vertical axis, up and down, indicates the number of issues that are on the table at any given point in time. And the horizontal axis is sort of the timeline through a project, in this case an environmental assessment. So you're going through the project, you're identifying the problem, you're identifying alternatives, you do a scoping process, you do the environmental documentation, 1 million comments come back, you have to do some more studies to answer those comments. And when do you have the most questions and unanswered problems out there on the table? Right before you have to make the decision. So what happens is the CSS process allows you to change from a diagram that looks like that to one that looks a lot more like this. The idea in CSS is to get all those ideas, all those questions, all those issues out on the table as early as possible. And then as you move through the process, you resolve them. So by the time you're ready to make a decision, most of the critical issues have already been resolved. So a structured decision process determines the decision points in the process, who's going to make each decision, who's going to make recommendations for each decision, who's going to be consulted on each decision, and how those recommendations and comments will actually be transmitted to decision makers. And these determinations acknowledge who actually has the authority to make decisions. And I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but it isn't. Very often, there's a question about in projects that take place in cities but are on state routes, the question is, well, what's the role of the city council in all this? Or where does the buck really stop in the DOT? These are huge organizations that have lots of different pockets of people. Who really is the decision maker? Or in cases that Federal Highways is involved, what's the relationship between the Federal Highway and the DOT in making decisions? So this usually takes some ferreting out to figure out who has the authority to make decisions. The structured process also identifies intermediate as well as final decisions. Very often we are so focused on the final decision, you know, what's going to be the selected alternative. But really in a decision process there are choices that get made all along the way. What's the set of alternatives you're going to look at? What are the evaluation criteria? Which set of those alternatives are feasible? So there are decisions all the way along that need to get made. By clarifying the nature of the decisions within the process, we can structure the outreach to better figure out who the stakeholders are who need to provide input on that particular decision and what kinds of data we need to make that particular decision. This kind of a structure creates a level playing field for all the stakeholders so that everybody knows the rules of the game. They know what issues they can provide input on and when those opportunities are likely to come. It also facilitates cost-effective project delivery. If each step in the process is thorough and logical, it's much easier to resist the inevitable request to go back to square one and start over again. So it helps to build a momentum through the project. I do have some cautions about using structured decision processes. Decision makers are often very concerned about losing control when there's a structured decision process. But from my point of view, for the most part, this sense of control is a complete illusion. When was the last time any single organization had the power to make an implementable decision unilaterally? Support is usually needed from stakeholders, permit agencies, elected officials, from a number of jurisdictions, and so on. And a structured decision process can be used to shape the interplay of those forces and those interests. Decision makers may be reluctant to commit to a structured process because they feel the results might back them into a corner or tie their hands in some way. And it's very true that a structured decision process can make decision makers feel obliged to take the recommendations that come out of a stakeholder process. And sometimes they'd much rather resolve issues in the back room politically. You know, so this is a very transparent process. And they will be under much more pressure to accept the recommendations that come forward. And it's also true, oh, I'm sorry, you have a question?
I was looking at this whole model you have for decision making, and it's very similar to what we use, for instance, for the South-North Interstate, or the South-North Max, which ultimately failed. That is, they went through this long process, got all the stakeholders and such. But the problem is in your problem definition, there's already a political, how should I say it, various political axioms. That is, something needs to be done, we need to do one of the following solutions, and then they bring it to the voters, and the voters reject the whole thing.
Right,
I mean, the whole process was wasted. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, it's a good point you bring up. And I just finished a project in Eugene, which is a city that has a lot of political controversy, shall we say. I mean, a lot of different political perspectives. The I-5 Beltline Interchange project is right at the edge of the city of Eugene and Springfield. They're very different in their sets of values, and the Lane County also brings a whole different perspective. We went through a structured decision process. We ended up with 100%, all 5 jurisdictions that were involved in it were in favor of the solution that came out of the process. The key to that is exactly what you're pointing out, the problem definition. The initial problem definition that the DOT put forward on that project was rejected completely by the community. We spent, I don't know, a long time, months, honing the problem definition to a point that it was a problem that was recognized in the community as a problem. And it turned out to be a safety problem because the interchange was sort of outdated in its design. That was something people understood because there had been a lot of fatalities, and they could buy into that. They absolutely would not accept the need for more capacity. in the original project or problem definition had talked about capacity. So getting to a point where the community and the agency were in agreement about what problem they were trying to solve was a huge key to making that project successful. So I agree with you that very often agencies go out with some, routine sort of definition, and there's no connection between that and what the public feels is the problem. And there has to be that agreement, or else you're wasting your time. So I don't know if that helps, but you can go through processes that look good, but I mean, if you don't get to agreements at each step along the way, I don't think you're really making progress. So I think that gets back to this sort of need for agencies to embrace structured processes in a way that isn't just lip service to the process. It really means that they have got to be open to committing themselves to going through these processes with the public and reneging on them if they get in the middle of them and find that they can't agree with the community about something. If they renege, then they've lost a whole bunch of credibility, and they do have to go back to square one completely. Another problem or difficulty with these structured processes is the critical need to get all of the stakeholders involved, to get a balanced group of stakeholders. And that's much more of an art than a science. If all of the interests aren't at the table, it's possible then that interest will be raised later on after the process is complete, and it will force things to go back to a square one situation, or will lead to political opposition or a legal appeal after the alternative is selected. So in a structured process, it's not just a matter of providing opportunities for the public to participate. It's really the agency's job, or your job as the planner, to get the interest to the table and to make sure that they are participating in the process.
Do you suggest a process for documenting, basically this whole public participation process or stakeholder process, and then how do you go basically to make sure that, decisions are not talked about, numerous times, and you have to just, make some decisions and move on? Are you going to talk about that a little bit?
Documenting the process is essential. The documentation is then the basis for environmental NEPA documents and other kinds of documentation that are needed to get various environmental approvals and permits. So documenting what happens along the way is critical. And as I was saying to this gentleman, I think the key thing about getting the benefit out of this process, the whole benefit is the momentum that you get. And if you don't come to the end of a step in the decision process, for example, the first step is the problem definition, getting agreement on that and documenting it and say, okay, we did that, now we're going on to the next step, really makes it much harder for people to come back and question what you did in that first step. So documenting a conclusion that you've reached in a thorough public process and then moving to the next step is what builds that momentum as you go through.
And, one follow-up question, how do you deal with a turnover type of situation when you have a lot of people becoming involved
That's
in
what this
leading the
last
process?
bullet here is. I'll just talk about it now, this need to manage change. My strongest advice is that it's important to get through these processes as quickly as possible. 9 months is about as long as I think you can hold these things together. And often you hear about EISs lasting 4 years or, some outrageous amount of time. I don't think it's possible to have a credible public process that lasts that long because people change. Elected officials change, important stakeholders, opinion leaders change, things happen in communities that really change the whole nature of what you're dealing with. So the need to be able to manage change as you go through it is very important. And I think in terms of changing stakeholders, individuals who change, it is a lot a matter of going back and briefing people in terms of what's happened, show them what the process has been, try to give them the benefit of all the discussion that's happened already so they don't feel a need to reintroduce all the things that you've been through already. It's easier said than done, but it can be done. especially if you're building credibility in the community. These new participants will feel that and will feel okay to be able to continue. Teresa, did you have a question? Oh, okay. Okay, so I think that I'm a strong advocate of structured decision processes. There are lots of good examples where they've been used here in Oregon, but the key thing is to get buy-in from the agency or the project owner at the outset so that they know what to expect and they really are committing to it, because reneging in the middle is probably the worst thing that can happen to the agency and to the people who have been participating. So understanding these kinds of barriers and being willing to deal with them as a way to get to an answer that has community support is really what the trade-off is. All right, let's talk about the next critical success factor in context-sensitive solutions, which is reflecting community values. As I think has been obvious from what I've been saying so far, CSS requires meaningful public involvement. And this idea is pretty much old hat in Oregon. You know, we've heard about it for a long time, all through the 90s. But there's no question that we can do better at this. We can improve the effectiveness of our public involvement processes in two ways, I think. First, by incorporating stakeholders into the project team. And they become part of the project team with certain roles and responsibilities, with defined boundaries, just like other members of the team. I mean, we're not going to send bridge engineers into the field to delineate wetlands. And we're not going to have neighborhood residents figure out the length of the left turn pocket or the geometrics of an interchange. But there are certain things that neighborhood people or that community people are expert at, and we need their involvement, and we need to provide that role as part of a well-managed team, and they can make very valuable contributions in that way. Second, we can improve the effectiveness of public involvement by paying attention to our stakeholders' psychological and procedural needs as well as content. And this is what I mean by that. This is a stakeholder satisfaction triangle. As professional people, we tend to go right for the content line. You know, we understand the technical elements of a project, we look at alternatives, we sort of weigh them against what we know is going to work, and we come up with a solution. And we're really excited when we can come up with a solution that deals with all the issues that we've heard about from the public. And then we're really annoyed and surprised when the public just doesn't love our idea. And why is that? Well, it's largely because the public hasn't gone through the same thinking process that we did. And they need to. If a group of people is going to have a level of satisfaction with a solution that isn't their favorite solution, it has to be because they understand how we got there. So that's why it's critical to touch base with stakeholders at each point in this decision process, so that they understand the problem, they understand the alternatives that are being considered, they know what the evaluation criteria are, they know, how the evaluation came out. We must also pay attention, that's the procedural part of this triangle. We have to also pay attention to the psychological part. And I'm certainly not suggesting that we all become clinical psychologists. That's not what this is about. It's really about learning to pay attention to what people are saying, listening to them, and understanding what they're saying and how they feel about things. People can tell when you're just going through the motions and when you really mean it. So in a CSS process, it's critical that we pay attention to stakeholders, not because we're supposed to, not because it's the politically correct thing to do, but because we really need that information from them to do a good job. It's part of the process. Now, what everyone always says at this point is, well, yeah, but stakeholders have different objectives, and they're often conflicting with each other. These are the kinds of conflicting objectives that we see all the time. So that's true. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this kind of conflict among stakeholder objectives is a bad thing for a project. And that's because competing objectives provide a lot of opportunities. They highlight different interpretations of the community vision, And don't forget that vision is the context for the context-sensitive solutions. Competing objectives also provide the opportunity for in-depth discussion of trade-offs among alternatives. They enable stakeholders to learn from and even empathize with each other. It's not just what those weird people out there are saying. You know, it's Mary Jane who's sitting right here in the room with us talking about what she cares about. In addition, and I think very important for us, is that these competing objectives allow planners and designers to understand the context for decisions, and it encourages us to develop comprehensive solutions that really find common ground among all these competing objectives and balance out the needs. Any questions about this? I'm going to go on to the next one. Yes?
Maybe not a good idea for me to ask. How do you get to the first one, a community vision?
It's often possible that separate visioning processes are used by communities to figure out what they're looking at, not just for an individual project, but in a whole geographic area of a community. So obviously that's a very good way to do it. But if you're starting off with a project that's already a defined transportation need, then the vision has to be more circumscribed around that project. And it usually, at least in my experience, is done as part of that initial problem definition part, where it's important to go to all the different stakeholders in a community to find out what they are thinking this ought to be like in the future. And so it becomes part of how the problem is defined. For example, the transportation folks are likely to say, well, you know, we have mobility problems. We have, you know, a terrible level of service. You know, there's huge delays on this roadway or whatever. But the community might be looking at economic development activities, that there are certain areas of the community that aren't accessible, that could provide for future economic development. Or they might be saying that this roadway is a gateway to their community, and so they care about it in that respect. Or that there are historic properties, you know, located along the roadway, and it has to do with their whole community character, you know, what it looks like. So that's how the problem definition can get built up to really reflect a whole vision of what's needed out of this project by hearing all those different points of view. I don't know if that answers your question. Sort of.
Question, and maybe you'll talk about this later, but on projects that I've worked on, there's sort of the stovepipe mentality. And I worked on a very large light rail design project and was stirring things up, like bringing artists into the design and going and talking to the light rail operators, the bus operators, because we were designing some bus stop transfer points, and talking to marketing people. And I got in big trouble because I was a consultant to a transit agency that operated, and probably still operates, sort of like pass things over the transom. If you have right-of-way questions, you send it up to the right-of-way people. If you have, and you never talk to marketing. And if you had, you know, public relations problems or questions or issues, there was no mechanism for the engineers to talk to the public even. It was, in fact, frowned upon unless it was in a controlled environment.
It's interesting that you raised that, and I will get to this later on. The learnings from the DOTs that have actually implemented this, integrated project teams are critical. Bringing together a huge, I don't know, but an interdisciplinary group of people from the very outset of a project. So that is viewed as being something that's different about CSS projects and necessary to achieve them. So what you were doing is very much in the vein of context-sensitive solutions. Now, maybe you were out there too far, I don't know, but you know what I mean. The need to bring in a whole range of professionals, especially in urban situations, where, you know, every square foot of a cross-section makes a difference, where street ambiance is important, you know, in downtowns. The need for designers is viewed as very critical. Landscape architects is another part of it, a way to introduce themes that are meaningful to the community in the aesthetics of a project. So that's very much considered part of context-sensitive solutions. It depends a lot on the project. But let's come back to that when we talk about project teams. Okay. The third of the critical success factors is achieving environmental sensitivity. And that brings the question up of, well, how does CSS relate to NEPA? And the simple answer to the question is that good NEPA is good CSS, because the steps in the two processes are nearly identical. Both aim at selecting the best alternative. Both are intended to provide adequate information for decision making, and both provide an interdisciplinary framework for considering the positive and negative effects for the trade-offs. CSS also underscores the environmental review process hierarchy for approaches to dealing with environmental impacts. First, to completely avoid sensitive resources. Second, to minimize adverse impacts. And third, to mitigate for unavoidable adverse impacts. CSS also encourages the notion of enhancement. And enhancement's a concept that's been added to the NEPA discussion in recent years, although it's not part of the legislation. And it means a lot of different things to different people, and I don't know if you've heard about it at all. But the most helpful interpretation that I've found is to think about enhancement as doing a little more to make things a little better than they were before the project. It's definitely not to spend 5 times the mitigation budget to achieve some very lofty environmental goal. The idea here is to incrementally add benefit. So that, for example, if you're putting in a culvert, adding a fish ladder to the culvert might be an enhancement. It costs more, yes, but there's a very definite benefit that comes from it. And these are the kinds of improvements or enhancements that can really build credibility with the resource agencies and with the public. So the other thing is that the CSS process really encourages consideration of those things very early on in the project, so that they can be, so that the funding for them can be figured out ahead of time and incorporated. And really, this is the key message here on environmental elements, that it's really a different model from the traditional one. The traditional model does, we do an environmental analysis of predetermined alternatives. So we develop engineering alternatives and evaluate them for engineering things, and then they're thrown over the transom to the environmentalists, the environmental analysts, who analyze them for environmental impacts. In a CSS process, the environmental issues and constraints are identified at the very, very beginning of a project, right at the same time the traffic and engineering constraints are being looked at, and then both sets of data feed into the development of alternatives. So it's a much different model. Questions about that before I go on? Okay. The fourth of the critical success factors is ensuring safe and feasible solutions. So let's go back to that early definition that I gave you at the beginning of the talk. Context-sensitive solutions addresses equally safety, mobility, and so on. And what you hear from engineers very often, and maybe some people in the room would agree with this, is that I can't buy CSS. Safety always comes first in everything we do. And if we ever compromise safety or traded off safety with anything else, we would get sued. Smiles. Okay, so you can imagine someone actually saying that, because they do. But the truth of the matter is that we routinely trade off safety for other values. And here are some examples. Capacity versus safety. It's a well-documented research finding that protected signal phasing is safer than permissive signal phasing, but yet we allow right turn on red. Economics versus safety. 4-lane divided highways are clearly safer than 2-lane highways. So why do we accept 2-lane highways? They cost more. Stakeholder preferences. Research also shows that rumble strips, you know what rumble strips are, those bumpy things at the edge of roadways, are a very cost-effective way of reducing runoff road accidents. Bicyclists hate them. So on a lot of roads, we don't put them in because the bicycle lobby doesn't like them. So in thinking about context-sensitive solutions, we have to get the idea of safety off its pedestal and deal with it in substantive terms along with all the other values we're confronted with in making these kinds of solution decisions. Now, CSS certainly doesn't mean that we can throw away the book. Good design practices and risk management demand that we meet best practices or employ the standard of care. What we try to emphasize is that knowledge of what those practices mean in functional and performance terms is what's important, to encourage creative design that translates to safety performance, not just looking up numbers in a book. Another thing that engineers often say is, well, gee, if you're going to be that creative in your designs, we're going to have to take exceptions to standards all the time. But here are what we found out. Design exceptions predate CSS. They've been around as long as people have been designing roads. Design exceptions are not necessary to achieve a context-sensitive solutions, and in fact, the pilot states haven't increased their use of design exceptions even after they've implemented CSS. So there's a whole body of thought about how safety relates to CSS. And it isn't included in this talk, but if you're interested in that, I'm certainly happy to talk with you more about it later, or we can get to some of it in questions and answers. So let's go on to the experience of the pilot states. Actually, the 5 years or 4 years or so that these 5 pilot states have been implementing CSS has given us a pretty good base of information, a lot of lessons learned that we can build on. Some of the states approach CSS as a vehicle for transforming their whole organizations into more customer-focused places. Others just focus much more narrowly on just improving a certain set of processes. So what was really interesting in doing the work that we did on that report 480 I talked about was that all of the states had very common findings, despite how they had focused their efforts. They said that CSS has challenges in all of these areas, these 4 areas. And they all said that cultural change comes first. A Connecticut DOT staff person said, for example, if you're a customer-focused organization, these concepts are logical and inevitable. A Maryland person said, you'll love this, we have reached the realization that the highway department does not know what's best for everyone. That was a major finding. And another person in Connecticut who was referring to a demonstration CSS project that had just been successfully completed said, if we could do everywhere what we did here, we would waste fewer resources. Let me talk about that for a minute. A lot of times when I talk about CSS, people sort of say, that sounds very expensive. Because what they're thinking of is a Christmas tree. You know, each project is a Christmas tree. And so they have to put an ornament on for each interest group, you know, to make each interest group happy, some new feature of the project. And each of those comes with a price tag. But done properly, that's not the way CSS works. It's about trade-offs, not add-ons. And even if it were about add-ons, I think it's important to think about it, because having to do staff work on projects over and over, year after year, studies that just pile up, and I think you all know probably examples. Well, you talked about one before. That you can spend a lot of money and never achieve the benefits of a project if it's halted because of stakeholder conflict. So that when you think about what's expensive, it's important to think about it in relation to some of these other things.
I don't understand what you mean, trade-offs versus add-ons.
That achieving a community consensus about what a project should be doesn't mean that it has to cost more than if you used a traditional process. People think that if you go out and talk to stakeholders, you're going to get a lot of a wish list to do all this extra stuff, and it's going to cost more money. But if there is a top budget for what a project can cost, then you can trade off those different needs of the community and stay within that budget.
So you're talking about just involving your stakeholders in choosing which elements of the project.
That's exactly right. And the structured decision process that I described before is an excellent way of doing that. because when everyone understands why different parts of the community want different things, they can say, well, yeah, I understand that, but this other thing is more important. And there are tools that can be used to help weigh the relative value of different parts of a project, of different elements of a project. And my experience has been that if the public knows that you have actually seriously considered what they want, but yet determined that other things were more important, they'll accept it. Everybody knows that everybody can't get everything. It depends on sort of how you go about it, I think. Did you?
No.
Are you sure? Yeah. Okay. But getting to this place that agencies can do context-sensitive solutions requires sort of top-down leadership. This is part of the cultural change thing. And the kinds of things that the state said were needed are that there have to be champions at the very highest levels of an organization that promote context-sensitive solutions. People need to know that the agency leadership is really behind this. Often policy changes are needed, policy clarifications on the geometric design guidance. Remember I talked to how engineers tend to just go to the Green Book and pick a number out of it and say, that's the standard, we're not going to change it. So the idea that it's okay to look at the flexibility that's within that document to allow for greater design flexibility. Performance metrics related to CSS were viewed as a good idea, and all of them did broad awareness training for their staffs. Some other interesting, yes?
I'm involved in a transportation project that I see having a great difficulty getting the cultural change. My transportation project is Portland International Airport and its desire to build a third runway in about 30 years. Sustaining public involvement over a 30-year period to get a reasonable approach to this is very difficult. In addition, the port is directed by commissioners who are appointed to 4-year terms by the governor. They can only be removed from office for malfeasance, so they don't report to the governor. The executive director, Bill Wyatt, reports only to the commission. The commission is business people with a business focus. How do we get some sort of buy-in to these cultural issues that would involve some stakeholders other than the airlines? Mm-hmm. And there is a bunch of noise around the airport, and a lot of the citizens that live nearby do feel like stakeholders.
Well, they are.
What advice do you have? In addition, I guess we could look back at the FAA, whose policy is probably pre-1960s with a DAC approach. That is, they decide and announce, and they don't even bother to defend because they don't listen to any arguments. What advice do you have for people like me?
Oh, dear. It's not an easy situation. I mean, airport expansion is probably one of the hardest ones, really. And there have been almost no new airports built. I think DIA in Denver was like the newest airport, and that took a really long time. And anyway, so it's not an easy thing to expand airports at all. And it seems to me that it's the question, going back to what Lynn was saying or asking about earlier, this is a visioning kind of thing. You know what I mean? That this isn't like starting a project to say, okay, should we build a third runway? Yes, no, where? And going into it from a project point of view. I think this is a matter of raising community awareness, broad community awareness in terms of, the port would talk about the economic development benefit to the community, jobs, the other kinds of broad effects positive effects that such a development could have, and really trying to create a dialogue at the big picture level for some period of time to interest stakeholders, broader groups of stakeholders, beyond the people who hate the noise who live around it and beyond the airlines. Because if that's the battle you're into, you're never going to get there. So I think trying to understand, again, the full range of stakeholders, which is the whole community, really, and moving from that perspective to talking about what it would mean in the future and what kinds of conditions would be the right ones to trigger such a development. Trying to get agreement about those broad policy items would seem to be a place to start. It's a very hard situation. I don't envy your situation at all. Other questions? All right, let me talk about a few more things about what we learned from the pilot states, and then we can go into more general discussion. This is your point, Rob. Many of the states recognize the importance of creating multidiscipline project teams. Oregon DOT actually does this better than most DOTs, by the way. And it was the need to involve environmental and design staff in planning decisions, but also involving construction staff in design decisions. And the construction thing goes both ways. Often planners and designers think, well, gee, we better tell the construction guys that, that they need to make sure not to take out those trees, they better not block this driveway, they better honor the commitments that we made during the planning process. But it does go the other way, too. If you don't have construction people at the table during the design process, you could be making promises that are impossible to keep. So the idea of having people involved throughout the whole process of multiple disciplines is critical to getting at good designs, for one thing, and then designs that are implementable. So another thing that was very interesting, are you familiar with the idea of value engineering? Does that mean anything to anybody? Okay. Value engineering is often done after a design is completed, and it's trying to mostly cut costs. And so what has happened in these states noticed was that very often value engineering activities resulted in stripping out the very elements of the project that made it context sensitive. So if you're using a value engineering process, it's important that the people who are doing it understand where the elements of the design came from.
Yeah, isn't that because we haven't yet placed economic values on some of the context elements?
Right.
Like community impact or social impacts, things like that.
Right, and I don't know that we ever will or that it's even necessary, but I think that the boundaries around the VE studies can take care of that. You can say, look, this is a given. Don't touch this. I mean, most of the people at CH who do value engineering really look at it differently. They don't like to be brought in at the very end. They feel that if they're going to do a good job on value engineering, they need to participate, through the process. And really, the kinds of things that they look at would be accomplished in this kind of a process, I would think, rather than an add-on thing at the end. The other thing that was noticed by all these states is how critical it is to track commitments that you're making to the communities and to keep those covenants. Some would question, are you familiar with the Central Artery Tunnel project, that huge, big project in Boston? Okay, most people have heard of it. And I don't know that very many people would list that as a context-sensitive solution. Maybe. But they did make about 1,500 commitments to the community throughout that project. And they tracked them all on a website. People could go to it to see what the status of all those commitments were. And it was a huge step forward in building credibility with the community. So tracking commitments is something that gets a lot of points and is something that's really needed in CSS. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is remaining focused on the issues that are important to customers. And these are some of those. CSS implementation, and this is also Rob's point, generally requires the need for skill sets that aren't necessarily ones that the engineering leaders of projects have. And these were the ones that were noticed in every single state. Project management, public involvement tools and techniques, project decision making, and risk management approaches. So states, these 5 states have developed and delivered week-long training programs in these to a lot of their staff. And I think the most important one of them is project management. And I think this is important for you to know, that these are skills that are really important in the future for management of any kinds of transportation projects. So when people talk about project management, what they mean is resource management, both staff and budget, the ability to charter and form teams, facilitation and negotiation skills, knowing how to help people make decisions, decision-making tools, and communication skills. The other thing that they found is that there were technologies that were important to promoting CSS. Visualization capabilities, 3D visualization. People, the public, have no idea what a plan view of a project means. So being able to help people to visualize what it's going to look like is important. Traffic operational simulation is the same thing. People don't understand the results of traffic studies, but if you can show them a simulation of how traffic moves now and how it would move, it's very helpful. We've talked about decision-making tools. GIS databases are critical for being able to analyze a lot of the effects that we're talking about. I think the others are ones that you are probably aware of. So, to sum up, the 5 states went through a lot of trouble and a lot of organizational difficulty implementing CSS. But to a state, they felt it was critical to make the point that even though it was a lot of hard work to change, that they thought they and their taxpayers benefited tremendously from the implementation of CSS. And the benefits can be characterized in these ways. Minimizing cost and time delays associated with rework or redesign, structured and collaborative design processes and decision processes that I've talked about do create a forward momentum that cuts back on the time that it's likely to take to get through them. It reduces the need to go back to square one all the time. And they also build a very strong documentation, this was your point, for defense against litigation, because you can really show how you got through the process. Reducing investments in mitigation. The CSS approach focuses on identifying and avoiding environmental constraints early in the process and reduces mitigation costs of selected alternatives. This next one, improving staff morale and productivity, isn't a huge surprise. I mean, if you're delivering projects that are community assets, people feel really proud of that, and they like to work on those projects. So people feel better about coming to work every day, and that's an advantage for an agency. Delivering the benefits of projects earlier, I talked a little bit about this before, but delays in project delivery causes a delay in the stream of benefits that the project is set up to deliver. So reducing hours of delay, lives lost, injuries suffered, increasing job creation, property value enhancement, and so on. Delays in projects can have really tragic consequences in the case of substantive safety problems, where people are getting killed and there's nothing happening because we can't get together with stakeholders. And last, but certainly not least, is that focusing attention of the agencies on their customers is a good thing. All the pilot state DOT leaders agree that ultimately their agency's success rests on the ability to meet customer needs in an efficient and effective way. So I hope that this overview of CSS has intrigued you and given you some ideas that you can use to move forward with your careers in transportation. So I'm certainly happy to take questions, more questions.
I wonder if you have an example just from the case studies that you reviewed, that's something that sticks out in your mind about what an agency did to change their management or organizational structure to let this happen.
A lot of it was changing the project teams. A lot of you have spoken about this, very narrow focusing, that the engineers do this, and then the environmentalists do this, and then the landscape architects come in at the end, and then the construction people. By creating interdisciplinary project teams, including a lot of public involvement and outreach expertise, and really approaching the project from that point of view is what has made huge difference in the way projects are actually delivered. And that's a big deal in a DOT, believe it or not, because they have all these separate departments and they never talk to each other, or at least in a lot of cases.
Just to follow up on that, so what had to happen? So I can see you get this group of people on the team, but what requires that anyone participates and keeps coming? I mean, if it's not something that they've done in the past. And so I guess I'm wondering
Well,
if there was
these were in, I'm trying to, I think in Maryland specifically, they really had, at the beginning, when they were first starting out to implement CSS, they created work teams that said, gee, let's look at our processes and figure out what isn't working here, and let's change them. So it was an official act of, the directors of the agency said, we're going to create project teams in a new way. We're assigning people to these teams, and they are supposed to do these things. So it was actually a process change in the way they did their work. It wasn't just a one-off kind of, deal for a demonstration.
Did any states try something that might have failed?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure that, this process isn't a guarantee of success. I think, if I didn't say that, I certainly will now. It's just that it gives you a better chance of success, especially on controversial projects, than you would have otherwise. So mostly what you see in the literature and what you get when you interview people are the success stories. So, I'm sure they're not universal. And some projects are so mired in baggage and bad occurrences from the past that probably nothing can save them. So it's not a panacea by any means.
I don't know if you can get back to the slide. I know it's a little bit back with the two different charts, public process at the end and public process at the beginning. I was just curious about that, if it's not more of like a two-hump chart where you have the big spike in the beginning of public process and public input, but then you have to have a review at the end as well after you've taken all their input and put it into a thing. I mean, because some people might argue that you're doubling up. That's the one, where at the end,
right?
The next slide shows doing more public input at the beginning, but then wouldn't there be a hump there at the end where you have to go back to the public with your alternative proposal?
Well, yeah, I mean, this doesn't show all of the iterations of going back to the public. I think, as I was saying before, the idea of a structured process is that at each milestone in the process, you're back with the public. I mean, you're touching base with the public at each step in the process. The notion is here that if you get all these issues out on the table at the beginning and you're developing an evaluation framework that takes into account all those issues, and you're developing alternatives with all those issues in mind, that you're going to stand a much better chance of resolving them in the alternatives that you put forward. Do you know what I mean? That it happens just as part of the process if you know those issues out front. What happens so many times is that the alternatives are developed, in a back room somewhere, and the issues aren't even known until you put it out there, in a document someplace. And then, all hell breaks loose because people say, well, you can't do that.
Can you go back a slide?
And Marcy, I was just going to add to that it really isn't a matter of going back to the public there either. They're with you all the way through that process.
Exactly. Thank you. That's critical. That really is. That's the whole point. Yes?
I really appreciated the triangle, the concept of that triangle, and bringing on board the psychological aspect. I'm wondering if you've been privy to experience on projects elsewhere at CH2M Hill or with other clients that speak specifically to the psychological problems of dealing with temporal issues. That is, a stakeholder population that has concerns about today or next week, dealing with a project that has a time frame or a planning horizon that's like long. 15 or 20 years.
On the Pioneer to Eddyville project, or what used to be called that, which is Route 30, right, going from Corvallis out 20, going from Corvallis out to the coast. goes through a lot of little tiny communities, and ironically, the whole center of one of those communities is the post office. You know, it's sort of where everybody goes every day to get their mail, and people sort of know that each other are going to be hanging out there. The postmistress had been there forever, you know, so she was sort of like a community fixture. And this improvement of the road was going to take the post office out. And so people were concerned about that institution on a very, you know, it's like next week they were afraid, you know, this wasn't going to be there because the post office had said they couldn't afford to put it back in because there wasn't enough business. You know, the woman was working part-time as it was. And so if anything happened, you know, it wasn't going to be reinstated. And so, you know, that was very much in the people's minds. You know, they knew that the road was unsafe. They knew people were getting killed there. They wanted it to be improved, but you know, they had this very short-term concern. And so it made it hard to focus on the rest of the stuff. And I think that acknowledging that was the key to getting their participation. And it wasn't like we could fix it, but we heard it. And we considered it in all of the work that we did. And we tried to figure out ways that it could be mitigated. I don't know if that exactly gets to your, but I think the key thing is, I think our tendency as professionals is to say, whatever it is you're talking about, Mr. Citizen, you know, that's not part of this project. You know, thank you, but we're not, you know, you're not on topic. And that doesn't help. So I think that the point you're making and the point I'm trying to make is that acknowledging how people feel about things, whatever they're saying, is part of what you need to pay attention to. And if it can't be dealt with at all, then explain to them why not and where it can be dealt with. You know, there's always some place that people can go to get whatever it is they're talking about heard. So instead of just saying, leave me alone, you know, it's not part of the project.
What prompted those 4 states that you looked at to go this route? I mean, it seems like there had to have been an upper-level person or a board
right.
or a commissioner or whatever. And so what prompts this shift in mentality? And then somewhat related to that is, what do you see going on in Oregon with respect to this at ODOT?
Top leadership is the answer. I mean, people who have that vision in their minds. And when you ask those individuals, you know, Tom Warren was the one in the DOT, Hal Kassoff, I think, was the one in Maryland who really started it. Sometimes it's just failure, you know, like just having seen failure time after time after time and realizing that there has to be a better way to do this, I mean, is part of it. But I think it's also just visionary people, you know, who see a new way that makes more sense to them. So it's hard to figure it out, but it is very much individual vision on the part of leaders that starts it, I think.
Were those leaders normally like the agency head, or did it ever come from like a commission type?
No,
level?
these were agency directors. And actually, you know, I don't know about the makeup of their commissioners in those states. The fellow who did the interviews from CH would know the answer to that. So maybe there was an influence there, and that might be something to find out about. But mostly you hear it from the perspective of the staff head of an agency. And in terms of Oregon, Oregon is very supportive of this concept. In I'm sure you've all heard about this cracked bridge program that's very big right now. One of the major things they were looking for in hiring a consultant to lead the management of that program was a context-sensitive solutions approach. They are really very much trying to get it integrated into their agency. I think it's hit and miss in terms of how well they do on given projects, just like in any agency. But from a top-down perspective, and even I think from a project management perspective, you know, more middle part of the agency, there's very much an understanding that this is the right way to do things and that they want to do it. So I think Oregon's in a really good position to move forward with this.
I think I heard you say that some of the cultural change started at the DOT level? And if it did, do you see there's any possibility of shifting that down a level, not just to the Federal Highway Administration, but to the FAA?
I've heard a lot about the FAA too over the years, and I haven't worked with them very much, so I don't really know. But my sense is that it's very much a part of transit operations now. These same ideas that I've been talking about in terms of highway stuff really apply to transit. And as they move from mode to mode, eventually aviation will get into the mix, would be my sense. What we really need to show, I think, is a track record of success. Do you know what I mean? If it can really be shown over time that this approach, number one, doesn't make projects cost a lot more, that it decreases the time for delivery of the projects, that it creates satisfied customers, those kinds of documentation, which people are looking for now. If that track record gets established, I can't imagine that it wouldn't affect the other administrations. That'd be my feeling for it.
Because it seems to me like a solution that people in my situation might need is get people like Earl Blumenauer, who is interested in such issues, to talk to DOT and say, spread the word.
I actually gave Earl a paper on this, that I wrote some time ago, just as a briefing thing, and I never really talked to him about it. But certainly I think that the congressional delegations will hear more about this if the DOTs are successful in moving it forward. Was there a question? Over.
CSS conception sounds like it creates lots of exceptions. And for engineers, how do they protect themselves when they're adopting these conceptions?
Yeah, tort liability is a huge issue, and I'm glad you brought it up. A lot of times engineers are very nervous about using what we would consider flexible standards on highway projects because they're afraid they'll be taken to court, basically, if there's an accident or something. And the notion here is that the agency must assure that roads are safe. You know what I mean? That's a major requirement for any transportation agency. And there's nothing in this whole CSS approach that would contradict that. But part of trying to figure out what makes a road safe is the issue. That taking a standard out of a book and saying it either meets the standard or it's unsafe is the wrong approach. There are two different kinds of safety. One is nominal safety, which means that it's consistent or complies with certain standards. The other is substantive safety, which has to do with the extent of predicting crashes on a given segment of a roadway given certain circumstances. So that crash prediction is something that is an analytical activity that goes on. And that is where you can really begin to understand whether a road is truly safe or not, because you're using research data and using analytical tools just like we use for other parts of our roadway work. I mean, we use analytical tools to predict noise impacts and air quality impacts. We use analytical tools to show where the traffic is going to go. We use analytical tools to talk about how much it's going to cost to build the road, or how much material, how much strength needs to be in girders, whatever. And so moving forward with our ability to analyze safety impacts using a lot of tools, and I don't have that stuff in this slideshow, but there is a lot of research that Federal Highway Administration has supported in recent years that gives us a lot of data that can be used to do those analytical analyses on given roadway segments. So encouraging engineers to use those tools to really be engineers instead of just using cookie cutter approaches out of books is really what this is about. So if those are done, documenting the exceptions isn't a very hard thing to do, and it will stand up in court. At least that's the feeling. You get a lot of different opinions about this from attorneys. Attorneys like you to do things that are in the book, that the way it's been done for a long time. And so there is a need to, for engineers to sort of step out and look at some of these other tools for documenting the safety.
Marcy, the new Green Book that just came out is significantly different from the old ones, and it has to do with analytical data and going back to studying things. And does that have to do with using context-sensitive solutions?
I think so, definitely. And there is the Federal Highways Administration has just put out a software called IHSDM, Interactive Highway Design Safety Module or something, and it's for 2-lane rural roads, but they're doing one now for urban situations. And it's an actual modeling tool that allows you to put a design in, and it will help you to do those analytics. So those kinds of tools are what we all need to encourage to get out there. And I think Rick, isn't that the direction of this new Green Book? Is that your sense? Okay. Yeah. I'm not an engineer, so I don't know too much about exactly, but that's what I've heard, is that is the intent of it.
Marcy, I don't want to put you on the spot here too much, but could you talk a little bit about the Philomath project a little bit? And there, it's the future projected context is a lot different than what people see today. And are there any lessons learned about how to work with stakeholders about that?
The Philomath project is sort of an infamous project in the Oregon DOT right now. Philomath is a small city near Corvallis that's on Route 20. Route 20 is a state highway, but it's their main street that runs through it. And it's very congested on weekends because people are trying to go or come from the coast. And it's a bedroom community for Corvallis, so there's a lot more commuting than there used to be. And it's a situation in which the downtown is so congested some of the time that local people can't get anywhere. You know, literally you can't turn out onto the highway for hours and hours at a time. So there was a need that was agreed by everyone, the DOT and the local community, to do something to increase capacity on that road, on the highway. And so in the 50s, even beginning in the 50s, there was an idea to put in a couplet, a one-way couplet. There are 3 parallel roads, you know, the highway and then 2 parallel roads near it. And it went through a lot of changes, you know, year after year or planning cycle after planning cycle. You know, there were various versions of this couplet that were talked about. And finally, one was adopted in the transportation system plan for Philomath. And the DOT said, okay, well, you know, now we're going to build it because it was adopted in the transportation system plan. And we were involved in coming in to do the design. And the DOT recognized that even though it was in the TSP, that there was a lot of community unrest about it because, as Rick says, this couplet would take a lot of traffic off the highway where all the businesses were located, and the businesses were afraid that their livelihood was just going to go down the tubes because half of the traffic wouldn't see their businesses anymore. And so instead of just going in and doing a design of the couplet that was in the TSP, the DOT, in a context-sensitive approach, felt like, well, gee, you know, this design was done some years ago. There's been new community interest. We better go in and really make sure this is the right solution. So we did a context-sensitive solutions process with a structured decision process and so on. And what we learned was that, it was extremely controversial and extremely ugly, I guess you might say, that in addition to the normal conflict that comes about when you're really talking about changing the way a community is going to look and feel to local residents, you expect there to be a lot of issues around that. But this got to be a very personality-driven, ugly thing where, you know, there was a lot of name-calling, there was people were trying to recall elected officials, where there were posters put up around town, accusing people of doing things. It was in my experience, it was probably about the ugliest situation I've ever seen, just in terms of its personal meanness. And so what we did to try to diffuse the situation a little bit, there had been a stakeholder group that was set up with a balance of all the interests, and we had gone through a decision process that identified a different alternative from the one that had been adopted before. It was a partial couplet. The main part of the road where most of the established businesses were located was still one main street. And then after you got through most of downtown, it went off into a couplet. So that it was sort of a hybrid that again, met a lot of the different stakeholder needs. It provided access to the community to the main street, but further west. And it provided the main traffic on the freeway, for the traveling, the through traffic, and so that made a lot of the businesses happy. So it was sort of an elegant solution that came through this structured decision process. But it was very hard for the elected officials who had supported the other decision to accept. And so it got very political. And what we did to try to diffuse the situation some was involve high school students. There had been a high school student on the stakeholder group because the high school is located near the project. And that high school student was an exceptionally bright, able person. He recruited others of his cohorts to go do a community survey. And they went door to door on a weekend and talked to hundreds and hundreds of the local residents and explained, what the situation was and what all the different alternatives were, and tried to get a feeling that wasn't coming from the consultants, it wasn't coming from, these outraged city councilors. It was sort of, if the kids were doing it, it sort of seemed like, well, maybe it was for real, it was okay. And it was touching people who hadn't been active yet in the process. And so when that came back with the result that in fact, the community as a whole did really want to move ahead with a project, and that they were willing to deal with the impacts of a couplet. I think that really broke the tension and allowed the city council to move ahead with a decision to go forward. That was a lot of stuff, Rick. I don't know if it was really getting at what you were talking about, but it's partly this thing that even if you go through a really perfect kind of process, it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't have issues to deal with, that it'll all turn out perfectly. But what was heartening about it was that in the end, the process stood up. The solution that came out as the best solution really turned out to be a solution that met a lot of the stakeholder needs and allowed for the politicians to move forward, even though there still was opposition. Just having the right solution doesn't mean that it moves forward on its own. Sometimes there's more process that's needed.
I want to thank you for coming today, and we hope to see a lot of you next week. Next topic is pedestrian and bicycle access to the Portland Airport. We have Scott King, an aviation planner from the port. Thanks.